what is going on in the South Pacific and China's moves against the nations there. And I know France is a little bit tentative on getting involved. Or before I bungle it up too much, why don't you tell us what's going on in the South Pacific with the nation of China?
So we're really seeing a new version of what was called the Great Game. And the Great Game at the end of the 1890s was the competition between Russia and Great Britain over Afghanistan as a gateway to India. And that was
Right.
called the Game. And now we have a Pacific Great Game between Australia and the United States, with the participation of Japan and South Korea, against China. So when I called in on your show a few weeks ago, I mentioned the 8-nation trip of the Chinese foreign minister Wang Yi, where he was trying to get all these countries to sign a regional security agreement. So basically to have a Chinese-run
NATO almost, yeah.
But not with mutual defense obligations, but for them to be providing the security guarantees and the training for
Right.
all of these Pacific islands. He entered into a lot of bilateral agreements, but didn't get the big overarching regional agreement that he wanted. Now, I'm sure most Americans are aware that the Pacific is a huge area, and it's basically lots of small island states,
Right.
like, Tahiti and Samoa and the Solomon Islands and Federated States of Micronesia. There's 18 of them that form what is called the Pacific Island Forum.
Right.
Now, they have their first in-person head of state level conference occurring in Fiji on the 12th to the 14th of July. And they have a lot of regional leadership issues they have to address. And they're also pursuing a long-term agenda, kind of like Agenda 2030, but it's called the 2050 Strategy for a Blue Pacific Continent, that has lots of sustainable development goal themes. It's very Agenda 2030-esque. Okay.
Right.
And amazingly, the Chinese foreign minister has, whilst all of the prime ministers are scheduled to be meeting at like a lunchtime afternoon retreat on the final day, he's invited all of the foreign ministers of 10 of the 18 countries, specifically excluding Australia and New Zealand, and the Federation of Micronesia, that is very American influenced, to a meeting at exactly the same time at which he made a second attempt to get them to actually sign the regional security agreement. So this is beyond diplomacy. It's like really attempting to rub Australia and New Zealand's face in the dirt by scheduling this at exactly the same time on the same day.
Right.
To achieve, failed to achieve a few weeks ago. And this is at the same time as at the NATO meeting in Madrid that has occurred this week. For the first time, we had Japan, Australia, New Zealand, and South Korea all represented at high levels for the first time ever at a NATO summit. And we've got this big, big push that supposedly now is being blamed on the Russian invasion of Ukraine to get what is called the NATO Pacific. Now, the Foreign Minister, Liz Truss of the United Kingdom, proposed at a speech a few weeks ago that there be formed a global NATO. So the next region that they're trying to do is a Pacific NATO. And so we have this massive power play between some of the large industrialized nations like South Korea and Japan that are close to China, that are trying to be brought into this defense agreement, which is called the Partners in the Blue Pacific.
Mm.
They have that, which is essentially American run, and then they have the Quad, which also involves India. And these are all directly an attempt to contain the expansion of China. So there's this enormous geostrategic game that is occurring literally for the entire perimeter of the Pacific Ocean that is going largely underreported in the United States. The Australians have announced that they're going to set up a defense academy. They're going to double their expenditure in the Pacific, but they're just being completely outspent and outmaneuvered. And the United States, in some of these relatively small states that haven't been an issue for decades, they haven't even had an embassy in them for 30 years.
Oh, wow.
And in the meantime, for the last 5 to 10 years, the Chinese have been offering university scholarships and sending agricultural experts, help them set up factories so that they can process their local goods rather than shipping them to the West as raw materials. And they are significantly culturally encroaching upon what historically was very much the backyard, which is now an offensive term, of Australia and New Zealand.
Right. Right. And the West in general. I mean, after World War II, I mean, the Pacific War was all about all of these islands, and America has maintained bases there forever. Just to illustrate what you're talking about, this is being reported, but it's not being pushed. The importance of it is not being highlighted in the mainstream media here in America. At least they are reporting it. CNBC says Australia commits to Pacific Island defense training as China seeks rival meeting, illustrating exactly what you just said. And you've covered really all of the important topics, but these stories are being reported and people can go find and do more research into exactly what's happening. As you put it, it is the great game. I mean, this is global chess, and it's not without stakes. I mean, the stakes are as high as they could possibly be, especially when you look at the way that Russia and Ukraine and the way NATO is acting there. It doesn't look like there's any slowdown. It looks like war may be on the horizon for all of us, around that whole catastrophe. So, I mean, this is very, very high stakes gamemanship going on over the South Pacific, and not a lot of attention is being paid to it, perhaps because the mainstream media doesn't want to report how successful China has been in their methods of, I don't want to say infiltration into these islands, but as you described, bringing them closer to China through economic outreach. And maybe the media either wants the American people not to know that that's happening because it's embarrassing, or perhaps because they quietly approve of the communists expanding their influence in that region. Just incredibly troubling stuff. And again, we thank you so much for coming on and sharing this with us, Simon. I'm sort of speechless. I'm sort of speechless since you dump all this information in our lap, and it's just like, I thought I knew how bad things were, and it can always get worse. And so thank you so much for coming on and sharing this with us. I mean, is there anything else that the InfoWars audience needs to know before we have to close out this segment?
Well, I think my final sign-off would be that a lot of the Pacific issue is about food. It's fish protein. And so even though these islands are relatively small in comparison to the entire sea area of the Pacific, you've got to remember that it's not just their territorial zone around these islands. It is what is called the exclusive economic zone.
Right.
And so that is actually, if you imagine you've got this little island in a huge sea of blue, and you put your pin with a string on it, the entire area that they actually control the fishing rights of, and this applies to Iceland in the North Atlantic as well, and the Faroe Islands, is a circle with a 350-kilometer radius. So then you draw an enormous circle with a 350-kilometer string around the island. That's the area where they control the fishing rights. So if China can do a deal on the fishing rights for all of those enormous and in some cases interlocking circles all over the Pacific Ocean, they basically are attempting to lock up the fish supply from the largest ocean on the planet.
Right.
That's why it's so significant. It's not just about having a few fighter aircraft on the Solomon Islands, unhappy though that makes the Australians. Their real goal is we want the lion's share of the fish from the entire Pacific Ocean.
Right. Right. And of course, this goes part and parcel with China expansion elsewhere. I mean, the Belt and Road Initiative. I mean, China, this just falls into a pattern of behavior that China's entered into at this point of really aggressive expansion and primarily focused on resources, like you mentioned, of fish and staple resources that are necessary, as well as rare earth minerals and that sort of thing. I mean, China is not bumbling around in the way that old Joe Biden and our government is. They are very focused and very aggressive in their ambition here and around the world. But I'm sorry, I cut you off. You were about to say something.
No, you've summarized the situation excellently. Thank you, Harrison.
Well, thank you very much, Simon. And again, we'll have to do this again very soon. It's always really kind of shocking talking to you because you have put so much time and effort into researching these topics and lay it out so clearly. And I know the InfoWars audience benefits hugely from the research that you've dedicated your time to. So just thank you once again for coming on. It's always a pleasure, even if it leaves me feeling a little bit less certain about the future.